In October 1962, Uganda stepped into the light of independence. A young country stitched together from kingdoms, chiefdoms, and districts that had long lived in parallel rather than in unity. Its constitution was fragile, its politics unsettled, and its sense of nationhood still raw. At the center of this delicate moment was Apollo Milton Obote, a man who seemed to embody both the hope and the uncertainty of the new nation. Born in 1925 in the dusty village of Akokoro in Lango, northern Uganda, Obote's childhood gave little hint of the power he would one day wield. He was bright, ambitious, and restless, pursuing studies at Makerere University in Kampala before working briefly in Kenya. But politics drew him back to Uganda, where he became one of the first generation of nationalist leaders pressing for independence. Obote was no aristocrat. He did not come from a royal house or from the prestigious Buganda kingdom. Instead, he built his base in the Uganda People's Congress, a party he founded in 1960. The UPC drew its strength from northern Uganda, but also from those outside the Buganda establishment, smallholders, workers, and communities who felt excluded by Buganda's dominance. To secure power, Obote forged an unlikely alliance with the Kabaka Yeka party, which represented the interests of the Buganda kingdom. This marriage of convenience allowed Obote to become prime minister, while Kabaka Edward Muteesa II became Uganda's first president. It was a precarious balance, one man a Republican nationalist, the other a monarch steeped in centuries of tradition. The early years of independence were filled with optimism, but cracks appeared almost immediately. Buganda's leaders wanted to protect their kingdom's autonomy, including control over land and culture. Obote, however, believed in a centralized republic, where the authority of the prime minister stretched across every corner of the country. This clash of visions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to tear the coalition apart. By the mid-1960s, Obote's government was rocked by scandal. He and close allies were accused of profiting from Congolese ivory and gold smuggled through Uganda. Known as the Gold Scandal, it tarnished his reputation and exposed bitter rivalries in his cabinet. Facing mounting pressure, Obote responded not by stepping back, but by tightening his grip. He suspended parts of the constitution, sidelined opponents, and leaned heavily on the loyalty of the army. That loyalty rested on one man. Colonel Idi Amin, a towering figure in the Ugandan army, feared and admired in equal measure. Amin had risen quickly, his charisma and ruthlessness making him indispensable. But his ambition was obvious, and his popularity among soldiers and ordinary Ugandans grew to the point of overshadowing his prime minister. In February 1966, Obote struck a bold and dangerous blow. He ordered the arrest of 5 ministers, accusing them of plotting against him with the support of the Kabaka. He suspended the constitution, consolidating power in his own hands. The Kabaka, enraged, called for Obote's resignation. Instead, Obote unleashed the military. On May 24, 1966, the Ugandan army under Amin's command attacked the Lubiri, the royal palace at Mengo. The assault was ferocious. Shells thundered against the palace walls. Smoke rose into the sky. Loyal Buganda guards, armed with little more than rifles, fought desperately against tanks and heavy artillery. By the end of the battle, the palace was in ruins. Kabaka Muteesa II escaped only by the narrowest of margins, fleeing into the night and eventually finding refuge in the British High Commission. From there, he slipped into exile in London, where he would live out his final years in obscurity, far from the throne of his ancestors. The Mengo crisis was a turning point in Uganda's history. Obote abolished the kingdoms altogether, dissolving centuries of tradition in a single stroke. Uganda was declared a republic, its monarchies stripped of power. To his supporters, Obote was a modernizer, breaking the hold of feudal systems and creating a unified nation. To his critics, he was a destroyer of heritage, tearing at the cultural fabric of the country. But if the crisis gave Obote unmatched authority, it also deepened his dependence on the military and widened the gulf between him and many Ugandans. Buganda never forgave him. Other regions, too, began to see him not as a unifier, but as an authoritarian. Still, Obote pressed forward. In 1969, he launched his Move to the Left, a set of economic reforms aimed at pushing Uganda towards socialism. He nationalized banks, insurance companies, and major industries, claiming majority state ownership. He spoke of empowering the common man, But in practice, corruption flourished. Prices soared, businesses collapsed. The reforms sowed anger and fear among traders and farmers alike. That same year, violence came to Obote personally. On the night of December 19th, 1969, as he left the UPC party conference at Lugogo Stadium, a gunman stepped from the crowd and fired. The bullet tore through Obote's face, shattering 2 teeth and ripping his cheek. Bloodied but alive, Obote was rushed to safety. The pistol jammed before the assassin could fire again. A second attacker hurled a grenade, but it failed to explode. In the chaos, both men escaped, though they were later captured and linked to opposition networks. The assassination attempt hardened Obote further. Opposition parties were banned outright. A state of emergency was declared. Thousands of political opponents were detained without trial. His cousin led the feared General Service Unit, a secret police force accused of torture, disappearances, and widespread brutality. Obote's Uganda was sliding deeper into repression. Food shortages and high prices fueled discontent. Relations with foreign governments, once warm, turned icy. Even his alliance with Israel collapsed after disputes over support for rebels in southern Sudan. Yet Obote remained convinced of his mission, presenting himself as a visionary guiding Uganda towards self-reliance and equality. But beneath his speeches, the ground was shifting. His reliance on Idi Amin had turned dangerous. The commander of the army was now the most popular figure in Uganda. Amin's name carried weight in the barracks and on the streets, whispered with both fear and admiration. In January 1971, Obote travelled to Singapore to attend a Commonwealth conference. It was a moment he had looked forward to, a chance to bolster his international standing. But while he was away, the loyalty he counted on evaporated. Idi Amin seized the moment. As Obote's plane left Entebbe, tanks rolled into Kampala. Amin declared himself head of state. Crowds cheered in the streets, welcoming him as a liberator. Obote's ministers were arrested, his allies hunted down, his rule dismantled in hours. For Obote there would be no return to State House that day. His power was gone, his enemies triumphant, his supporters scattered. What followed was the beginning of a long and uncertain journey in exile, a journey that would define much of the rest of his life. When the news reached him in Singapore that Idi Amin had seized power, Milton Obote's world collapsed in an instant. One day he was the head of state, the next he was a political refugee with nowhere to go. His allies at home were being rounded up or executed. His base of power in Kampala had been swept away in hours. The man who had abolished kingdoms and centralized power found himself without even a palace to return to. His first stop was Nairobi, Kenya. The choice was logical, close enough to Uganda and home to a growing network of Ugandan exiles. But Obote quickly discovered that Nairobi was not a safe haven. The Kenyan government, wary of provoking Amin and suspicious of Obote's ambitions, restricted his movements and blocked his efforts to contact loyalists back home. The telephone lines he tried to use were cut, the meetings he attempted to organize disrupted. For a man who had once commanded an entire state, it was a humiliating fall. And yet, Obote was not ready to surrender. He turned south to Tanzania, where he found a friend in President Julius Nyerere. Nyerere was a fellow believer in African socialism, a leader who admired Obote's intellect and shared his distrust of Idi Amin. In Dar es Salaam, Obote finally found safety. Tanzania became his sanctuary and his base of operations for nearly a decade. From the moment he arrived, Obote began to rebuild. He gathered exiles, politicians, students, and soldiers who had fled Amin's purges and persuaded them to prepare for a counterstrike. With Nyerere's support, training camps were established. Men drilled with old rifles and makeshift uniforms, vowing to march back into Uganda and restore their leader. In speeches to these fighters, Obote promised that Amin's rule would be short-lived, that tyranny could not last. But exile brought not only opportunity, but rivalry. Obote was not the only Ugandan in Tanzania seeking Amin's downfall. Other exiles, monarchists still loyal to the Kabaka, conservatives disillusioned by Obote's socialism, and young radicals like Yoweri Museveni were also plotting their own routes back to power. For them, Obote was not a savior but a rival. The exiled community fractured into factions, each distrusting the other. In September 1972, Obote took his boldest step. He launched an invasion from Tanzania. leading a force of several thousand exiles across the border into Uganda. His fighters were poorly equipped but determined. Obote believed the people inside Uganda would rise to join him, that Amin's regime would collapse under the weight of popular revolt. He placed particular faith in underground networks that he was told had been organized by Museveni and others to coordinate a mass uprising. But the uprising never came. Ugandans did not flood the streets in support of Obote. Amin's forces, though brutal and disorganized, responded with speed and ferocity. Tanks and heavy guns shattered the invading columns. Hundreds of exiles were killed, many more scattered in retreat. The invasion ended in disaster. For Obote, the failure was crushing. He returned to Tanzania embittered, convinced that some of his supposed allies had betrayed him. He accused Museveni of exaggerating his underground network, of promising support that never existed. The rift between the two men grew into an enduring enmity, one that would shape Uganda's future long after both had returned from exile. The failure of 1972 also reshaped Obote's life in exile. Internationally, Tanzania came under pressure for supporting the invasion. To appease critics, Nyerere officially closed the rebel camps, forcing Obote to keep a much lower profile. Many of his fighters were resettled in remote parts of the country, turned into farmers and laborers. Obote himself retreated to Dar es Salaam, where he was given a modest beach house not far from Nyerere's own residence. For years, he lived quietly. He gave no public interviews. He rarely travelled abroad. Instead, he read voraciously, corresponded privately with a small circle of loyalists, and received occasional visitors. Tanzanian officials continued to address him as president out of respect, later simply calling him Mzee, the elder. To the outside world, he seemed almost retired. But beneath the quiet, Obote never stopped plotting. He trusted a small cadre of loyalists, among them David Oyita Ojok, to maintain underground operations inside Uganda. They set up a secret navy of 6 small boats on Lake Victoria, smuggling coffee to finance rebel activities. They tried to establish assassination networks to eliminate Amin's key supporters. They even launched small raids across the border, though most were little more than pinpricks against Amin's increasingly paranoid security apparatus. The truth, however, was sobering. Obote remained deeply unpopular among many Ugandans. Even those who despised Amin did not necessarily want Obote back. His abolition of the kingdoms, his authoritarian rule, and his economic policies had left bitter memories. Among Baganda in particular, the destruction of the palace in 1966 remained an open wound. To them, Obote was no liberator but the man who had stolen their heritage. Exile was therefore not only a waiting game against Amin, but also a struggle against his own reputation. He needed time, and he needed Amin to make mistakes. Amin obliged. Over the course of the 1970s, his regime descended into chaos. Political purges, economic collapse, and international isolation turned Uganda into a pariah state. Hundreds of thousands of Ugandans fled, swelling the exile communities in Kenya, Tanzania, and beyond. Amin's bizarre antics, declaring himself conqueror of the British Empire, offering himself as King of Scotland, drew laughter abroad but terror at home. By 1978, Amin's power began to unravel. His decision to invade Tanzania's Kagera region backfired spectacularly. Nyerere responded by mobilizing the Tanzanian army and supporting Ugandan exiles in a full-scale counter-offensive. For Obote, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He rallied his followers, many of whom joined the Tanzanian campaign to topple Amin. In 1979, Amin fled into exile, first to Libya, then to Saudi Arabia. Uganda was free of his dictatorship, but it was far from stable. Nyerere and the Tanzanian army, unwilling to reinstall Obote outright, handed power to an interim government. Obote returned to Kampala in triumph, but not to State House. Instead, he watched from the sidelines as a succession of leaders, Yusuf Lul, Godfrey Binaisa, and eventually a presidential commission, tried and failed to stabilize the country. For Obote, the years of exile had been a test of patience and survival. He had fled humiliation in 1971, built a fragile movement in exile, endured betrayal and failure, and waited in silence while Amin's madness consumed the country. Now, with Amin gone, the question remained, could Obote truly return to power, or had his years in exile left him too weakened, too mistrusted, to lead Uganda again? That question would be answered in the turbulent election of 1980. But for nearly a decade, exile had shaped Obote into a different kind of politician. Quieter, more calculating, less visible, yet still determined that Uganda's story was not finished without him. In July 1985, Milton Obote's grip on power was broken for the second time. Once again, it was not the opposition in the bush or political rivals in parliament who toppled him, but his own army. Brigadier Basilio Olaro Okello and General Tito Okello staged a coup, rolling tanks into Kampala and declaring the end of Obote's government. By then, Uganda was exhausted from years of civil war. The Luwero Triangle lay in ruins, hundreds of thousands were dead, and trust in Obote had evaporated. For Obote, it was a bitter déjà vu. Twice he had risen to the pinnacle of power, and twice he had been betrayed by those closest to him. With the army against him and no popular base left to rely on, he had no choice but to flee once again. This time, his destination was Zambia. President Kenneth Kaunda granted him asylum, but it came with conditions. Obote was to live quietly, avoid political agitation, and stay out of Zambia's own delicate politics. It was not the triumphant exile of a man come back. It was, instead, a retreat into silence. In Lusaka, Obote settled into a modest life. His house was comfortable but unremarkable, tucked away from the bustling city centre. He was rarely seen in public. For 20 years he kept an astonishingly low profile. To many Zambians he was virtually invisible. Some didn't even know the former Ugandan president lived in their capital. In fact, more people were familiar with Obote Avenue in the town of Kitwe, a busy street named in his honour, than with the man himself. Those who did visit him remembered a man who was both quiet and warm. He spent much of his time reading, discussing politics with old comrades, and chatting with family. Ugandan exiles, Zambian diplomats, and a handful of trusted friends would occasionally call on him, offering companionship in his long years of displacement. President Obote was a friendly person, recalled Vernon Mwanga, a prominent Zambian diplomat. I used to visit him regularly, along with some of his old comrades, just to give him encouragement to live on. But beyond this circle, Obote's voice faded. He gave fewer than 5 interviews during his 2 decades in Lusaka. He rarely commented on Ugandan politics, even as Yoweri Museveni rose to power in 1986 and consolidated his rule in ways Obote himself once had. For a man who had once commanded armies and abolished kingdoms, the silence was striking. Yet the quiet was not without purpose. Obote understood the terms of his asylum. To overstep them would risk expulsion, perhaps even assassination. He also carried the heavy weight of history. His return to power in 1980 had brought not stability, but war and massacre. By the time he fled in 1985, his name was stained. Exile offered him not just safety, but distance from a country that no longer wanted him. He lived as an elder statesman in waiting, but the waiting never ended. As years passed, his figure receded into the background of East African politics. The liberation struggles that had once defined the region gave way to new leaders, new conflicts, new ambitions. Uganda moved on without him. By the early 2000s, Obote's health began to fail. His kidneys weakened, and in October 2005 he was admitted to a hospital in Johannesburg, South Africa. On the 10th of October, at the age of 79, Milton Obote died. After 4 decades of political struggle and nearly half a lifetime in exile, his story ended far from the land of his birth. When his body was flown back to Uganda, the reaction was divided. President Museveni, once his bitter rival, attended the state funeral in Kampala. For some Ugandans, it was a moment of reconciliation, a gesture of respect for a fallen leader. But for others, especially survivors of the massacres in the Luwero Triangle, it was an insult that Obote should be honoured with a state funeral at all. Laid to rest with full honours, Obote left behind a legacy as contested as the nation he once ruled. To some, he was the man who had tried to forge unity from fragile kingdoms. To others, he was the architect of authoritarianism and bloodshed. Exile had stripped him of power, but it had not erased the shadows of his past. Milton Obote's second exile was not one of plotting or grand schemes, but of silence, waiting, and reflection. In that silence, he lived the final chapter of a life that remains one of the most controversial in Africa's post-colonial history.